We'll get started. Welcome, everybody. And we appreciate you taking the time to hear from us about these two grant opportunities coming up for strategic planning and technical assistance. We do have a slideshow we're going to launch. All right. So first of all, to introduce us on the call, I know many of you, but not all of you. My name is Maeve O'Day. I'm the Program Director at Berkshire County Community Foundation. And I'm glad to be joined today by two of my colleagues, Caitlin Healy, our Grants Associate, who works a lot on our grants application portal. And Ian, who's a Community Engagement Officer that works with our Center for Nonprofit Excellence that oversees these two grant processes. And then we're also joined by Doug Sauer, a strategic planning consultant, who is going to speak about how an organization determines its readiness for strategic planning. We're very glad to have Doug here to share that information with us. And we are recording this call so that anybody who's interested, who was not able to make the call today, can listen to it later. It'll be posted on our website and actually be useful for many months to come.
Great.
All right.
As Maeve said, I work to support the Center for Nonprofit Excellence Fund. And the fund was established to help our region's nonprofit staff, board members, and volunteers better achieve their missions. And the foundation regularly offers grant funding, workshops, learning and leadership opportunities. And coming up in January will be the registration for the Institute for Trustees. So it's an annual virtual conference for board members and nonprofit leaders. The actual workshops, virtual workshops, begin at the end of March and go through the beginning of May. Registration will open on January 16th with early bird pricing through February 20th. And on the evening of March 20th, we will be welcomed by Marquise Victor, founder and executive director at Elevated Thought in Lawrence, Mass, talking about the evolution and role of a leader. So we hope you can join us. And here's a list of some of the topics that the workshops will be on. A new topic we've added is the human element. So we hope you can join.
Yeah, and there will be an e-blast going out with a link to register. So if anybody's on this call that's not getting regular e-blasts from us every quarter about grant opportunities and these kinds of opportunities, please be in touch with Aileen to make sure that we get you on the list.
Great. All right.
So we're here today to talk about the two grant processes, Berkshire County's third offering of our strategic planning and technical assistance grants, and then a sort of an allied but separate application process for strategic planning for the ARPA cohort through the city of Pittsfield. And we'll describe both of those. We'll go over the timeline for the two cycles, and then we'll have Doug's presentation. Then if anybody wants to stay on after that to ask some specific questions, please feel free to do so. You can also always email us with questions at any time as you're preparing your application.
Okay. So in addition to the supports I mentioned through the Center for Nonprofit Excellence, we also recognize that from time to time, nonprofits have a need and or an opportunity to engage in capacity building projects that require immediate additional resources. These projects can range from strategic planning assistance, board development, organizational assessments, evaluating business models, fundraising strategies, and on the technical side, website enhancements or database enhancement. And in response to this need, the Strategic Planning and Technical Assistance Grant Programming, in its third year, we are offering approximately $60,000 this year which is supplemented to Berkshire County arts and culture organizations by an additional $55,000. And that's through the Arts Build Community Initiative. A few examples of projects were financial planning for greater pay equity, website updates for better accessibility for people with disabilities, a community experiential audit, as well as board development. And our Senior Community Engagement Officer, Emily Bronson, is available for any questions. And that is that. Next up, we have the eligibility requirements for the grant, the Berkshire Taconic grant cycle. The organization must be a 501c3 or under fiscal sponsorship, be based in and serve residents of the Berkshire Taconic region, listed there. A priority to annual budget under $1 million, and a preference for first-time grantees, although that is not a requirement. And please do have a look at the full eligibility requirements on the website, the grant guidelines. If Caitlin, would you be able to drop those links in the chat?
Yes, they're in there.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Are there any questions? Okay, moving on to the review criteria.
Recording in progress.
So if people on the call could mute themselves, I think that will solve our feedback problem. Thank you.
Okay. Again, a full list of the grant guidelines. We'll list the full review criteria, but we are looking for projects that strengthen an organization's governance as well as their diversity. Preference will also be given to organizations whose projects, whose mission and programs are in alignment with the foundation's strategic priorities, educational attainment, community engagement, and economic opportunity. And so now to May for an overview of the City of Pittsfield ARPA grant process.
Yes, I think we have some of the cohort on the call, at least I hope we do. So this year, this is a one-year only partnership between the City of Pittsfield and Berkshire Taconic, and we're delighted to be useful to the city in this way. The City of Pittsfield had awarded $8.8 million in ARPA funding to 37 nonprofit grantees in support of programs and capital projects that respond to the impact of the COVID pandemic, and that will have a positive community impact. And then recognizing that that was a one-time funding investment, the city is working with community partners to strengthen their individual and collective impact and to help build sustainable programmatic and organizational capacity. And then one of the striking findings from a survey of the cohort was a number of organizations that either had not updated their strategic plan or did not have a plan for preparing or updating their plan. And so to support and encourage this to happen, and of course, a large part of the reason that it hasn't been happening is that we've all been dealing with COVID and its aftermath, which is still rolling through. But the city wants to encourage community partners to prepare and update their plans and has committed grant funding in the amount of $196,000 for this particular planning grant program, and Berkshire Taconic is administering this program on their behalf. So it has a separate application form and a separate grant guidelines page on the Berkshire Taconic website. So please be sure that you are looking at those if you're one of the cohort. It is focused on strategic planning, but it's also looking for requests for strategic governance and board development planning. We'll consider multi-year fund development planning, and will consider ARPA-funded program sustainability planning. So it's a really great opportunity for organizations to strengthen their board and their program work. And as I said, the cohort is 37 organizations. Berkshire County has reached out to those 37 organizations to make them aware of this grant opportunity. So anybody who received that communication is eligible to apply. If you're part of the cohort, you're eligible to apply. We reached out by email and also did some follow-up phone calls to make sure that, as far as we know, everybody was aware. We also negotiated with the cities to be sure that if an organization is part of the City of Pittsfield cohort, but has a planning need that is not under the criteria of the City of Pittsfield funding, but is under the, would be a fit under Berkshire County's regular planning and technical assistance grant program, an organization can make 2 applications, 1 to each of those cycles. And Berkshire Taconic has a preference for its cycle, which we're doing the 3rd round now, that it gives preference to organizations who have not yet received this funding. That does not apply to the Pittsfield cohort. So they are eligible to apply in the cycle. So again, the eligibility is primarily that organizations have received ARPA funding from the City of Pittsfield. And these again are the areas of focus: strategic planning, governance board development, development planning, and program sustainability planning. These will be one-time awards. This will be a one-time grant cycle. The maximum is up to $10,000. Again, the overall amount available is $196,000. We're not requiring matching funding, and the expenditures will be focused on costs associated with retaining consultants, trainers, or other outsourced services, and additional direct expenses. And as you're going through your application, if you have any questions about any of these details, please do be in touch with us. This is not a complete list of the criteria, but these are some of the primary ones. We're looking for positive and discernible impact on the organization's longer-term effectiveness and sustainability, particularly as regards services to the City of Pittsfield. It's very important that the board of directors and the staff leadership and other stakeholders are engaged in whatever is being proposed, and that there's real willingness to engage here. And then that the community partner is ready to move forward with the project, that it's feasible for them to take this on. Doug will speak more about that very shortly. The grants will be awarded this year, and then we will require a narrative report by June 30th, 2025. The grants are awarded, the applications come in through the Berkshire Taconics grant portal. The award notifications are made through the portal, and then grantees will receive a reminder to file this report ahead of the reporting deadline. And we'll be looking for a narrative report as well as an itemization of grant expenditures. And then just a housekeeping note that on January 9th, there's a quarterly convening of the ARPA partners at the Hotel on North from 2 to 4 p.m. They will be there too, and it will be focused on strategic planning. The timeline.
Yes, so the timeline for both of these cycles, applications are now open on our website through the links that Caitlin dropped in the chat. The deadline for submission is February 15th, 2024, and the review meetings will take place mid-March with notifications and grants awarded by March 31st of 2024. And as Maeve mentioned, the final reports are due to Berkshire Taconic June 30th of 2025. Any questions? Okay. So now we will hear from Doug.
I think you're muted.
Hello, everybody. You all hear me now? Yep, okay. I'm going to share a screen here. We just have a half hour here or so. So this is essentially a prep session on strategic planning. It's not all the ins and outs of the strategic planning, but just trying to how you think about it, how you organize it, how you can make it more efficient, and some ideas about that. And I'd be glad you could put any questions as we go on in the chat box. And we can also have any questions you have at the end. So it takes planning to plan, and strategic planning particularly is a process that once you get into, you may find you're into it more than you want to get into it, or it's costing more resources or time or effort or bandwidth, or you have a crisis that emerges during the process that derails it. It's something, the more you can think it through and plan ahead of time, the better for strategic planning. And that's really what the focus here is. Some of this will involve to what extent you may have a consultant involved early or a consultant involved later, and we'll talk about that. So what we'll be covering, I'm going to cover the definition and a general process. This isn't oriented towards what the whole process is. That itself could be a 3-hour session, but really just kind of framing what it is and what it's not, or what it could be. Strategic planning can be anything you want. There's people have different models out there and ideas, and I'm going to present something to you here, but it's really, what do you want to get out of it? And you can define it that way. We're going to talk about what's called synergistic planning and having an organizational culture, and pretty much that it's not just a plan document. It's really how much you think strategically as an organization. You're able to act on it. You're able to implement. You're able to change course if you need to, given circumstances. Certainly, the pandemic was a great example of everybody needing to change course, and we're still changing courses. And that's one of the reasons why, for the ARPA folks, a lot of folks halted their strategic plan or halted other plans that they were doing because the environment was changing so fast. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then in terms of your internal organization, and you're starting to think about engaging in strategic plan or engaging a consultant, we're going to talk about really having a discussion internally with your leadership team, your staff, your board members, around what's your motivation, purpose, and your vision. Why are you doing this? You want to avoid going into strategic planning and then spending a lot of time talking about why you're doing it, what you expect. Process that as much as you can before you get into the process. We're also going to talk about mission and values. That's also something that's good to process beforehand. A lot of folks, when they get into strategic planning, end up spending an inordinate amount of time talking about mission. And it ends up being wordsmithing, and it consumes a lot of resources. And it's better to have those conversations and then getting into the planning process. And if there's outstanding issues or debates that you have or different directions you may have, you can sort that out in the strategic planning process. But the more you know yourself when you get into it, the better the process is going to be, the more efficient it's going to be. And if you're hiring a consultant, you can keep the consultant within those time and hours that you're planning on. And we're going to talk a little bit about envisioning the process. What kind of process are you looking at, and what some of the options are. So those are discussions that I would encourage you to have before you jump into a process. And it kind of helps clear the air when clarify things within your own organization. A lot of prep is, what information do you need? What information do you have? And trying to get that organized again before the process. One of the other failures of process is people are trying to get information live as they're going through the process, and that delays it. You may not be able to get it. It may cost you more money than you think about. You're never going to know what all you're going to need till you get into it, but you can certainly frame that and find what your own capability is. Financial information particularly is a good example of that. We'll talk about that. And then selecting and engaging a consultant. As you're hearing, the grant programs, the consultants can be used for that. So how do you think about consultants? What's the right fit? How do you go about doing that? And then ultimately, we'll talk about the plan document very briefly. I don't know why I have a blank here, but so in terms of the definition of strategic planning, it can be a lot of things. And as I was kind of saying, and there's a lot of different models out there, and different consultants will have different models. And if you're a small grassroots community that's mostly volunteer, you're very different than a Harvard University. And you can bet your bottom dollar Harvard University did not anticipate they'd be going through the problems they're going through right now, which kind of gives you the example of how you have to think live and strategically. But what I'm using as a starting definition is that's an informed process, meaning it's based on data and information and your best assumptions that you can get and the team participation. And it's an engaging process. A lot of folks will say the process of strategic planning can be more important than the plan itself. If it's really engaging your leadership and getting your folks to think strategically, the plan document is a tool that can change. So you think about being very live. It's not a plan that sits on the shelf and you revisit it every 3 years to see what you did. It's a document that should change regularly as we're all in very rapidly changing environment, technology-wise, demographically, policy-wise. Things change. So you're trying to create a blueprint based on the best information you have, based on participation that you have within your constituencies or stakeholders, however you may define that, and what you assume is going on in your environment. And with that, you're looking at that in terms of your mission, who you are, why you exist, and we'll talk about that, your vision, where do you want to be as an organization, and what your values are. And your mission, vision, values will pretty much drive your priorities and what your goals are and strategies to move ahead. Some strategic plans are very micro-oriented, get some very detailed work plans. And as we're going to talk about, initially you have to have the broad plan and know the directions you're going to and have your team moving in that direction and thinking that. The work plans and specific plans will follow, and we'll talk about that. Also, within a multi-year period, what's happening, if we were just talking about this 10 years ago, people would talk about people doing 5 or 10-year plans. That rarely happens now, except for maybe capital planning, which takes a long time. Planning generally are occurring within a 3-year period for most nonprofits because of the changes that are occurring. And also from a fiscal perspective, during your fiscal year, you have money that was given a year that goes into this year. You have money that's given for your current fiscal year. You have grants and money that comes from this year into next year. So you're generally thinking in a 3-year fiscal cycle, one way or the other. It doesn't mean you don't have a broader 5-year or 10-year vision, but moving the organization, making decisions about the organization is generally going to be within a 3-year kind of period. For some reason, I'm missing, so I have some blanks in here. This is a visual of what I was just talking about. You have a rapidly changing environment. You want to be grounded in your mission, vision, and values. And as we'll talk about, some of you may have that very clear. Some of them, there's debate within organizations about their mission. Sometimes board members or stakeholders like their favorite program. They think that's their mission. What your values may be stated. In many cases, it may not be stated, may be implied. But you want to know your mission, vision, values as you look at your environment, your opportunities and threats, and you'll hear the term, and you're probably familiar with the SWOT. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. That's the general model. There's a lot of other terminologies. It always kind of comes back to that one way or the other. But when you're doing strategic planning, you have a vision for where you want to move the organization. And I'm not looking at if you're a hunger program or feeding program that you're going to feed everybody. It's not a global vision. It's a vision. If you're sitting as executive director, you're sitting as a board member, what's going to be different about this organization 3 years from now? How are you moving the organization towards your mission? And think of it that way. If you're doing a business, you think about where you're growing the business. Think about it from that perspective in terms of strategic vision in whatever year time period you're having. And then take a very realistic look at your organizational health, your infrastructure, your capacity, your strengths and limitations. Where a lot of strategic plans fail is they have a wishful vision but they don't deal with the reality of what they have right now. If people just gave us money, we'd be doing all these things. So we just got to get people to give us money, and not really necessarily looking at your infrastructure, your status, and what you need to fix or what you need to improve or what your real threats are in terms of your organization. So if you're realistically and taking a hard look, and that's hard, whether it's at the board level, the staff level, the financial level, your consumer or your client level, you take a very good realistic look at that. And then you can realistically and maybe ambitiously plan where you want to be as an organization, setting forth your directions, your goals. And I'm using the word maneuverable strategies because strategies you can change. They may not work. The environments change. You change them all the time. Are you willing to change as you move forward? And what your accountabilities are in terms of how you're going to hold people accountable for fulfilling the strategies you're executing. It includes board members as well. Who's accountable for what? And how are you doing that accountability from an evaluation perspective? So this kind of graphically just shows it in a big picture perspective. This is for those that have done strategic planning, is kind of a simplified classic of what the process is. You start with your mission, vision, and values, who you are, what you believe in. You then do your analysis, including an organizational assessment of where your organization is, respective to where you think you want to go. And then you get into developing strategies of, okay, where are you going to go with your goals and how you're going to do it? You start executing it financially and otherwise. You evaluate it, and you may change anything along these lines. And I do want to say the vision, hopefully you're not changing mission because you're halfway through a strategic planning process and you feel you need to do it. Mission shouldn't be something that's particularly consumable. You may amend it, you may expand it. There may be some opportunities that you need to do from a legal perspective, your articles of incorporation, something to adapt some new programming or regulatory. But basically, your values aren't going to change during the process. Your vision may. You may find it's unrealistic, or there's other, as you go through a process, you may need to go back in your monitoring and say, maybe it's not achievable, or maybe you can achieve a lot more than you thought when you started the process. So it's a dynamic process. And as you're monitoring, evaluating it, you could change. You may change your analysis, you may change your strategies, you may change your direction, you may change your finances and your budgeting and where you're putting your investments. That's where it becomes a live process. It's not in isolation of everything else that's going on in your organization. And the decisions have to follow it for a strategic plan to work. The synergistic planning is a concept of looking at all the planning you may be doing as an organization. And if you've already done strategic planning and you have a most recent plan, then that's feeding into what you're going to be doing now. Maybe the plan was done 6 years ago and it's not relevant. That's okay, but revisit what plans you've had done in the past, how you've thought about things. Sometimes we keep reinventing the wheel and we keep doing the same thing over and over again, maybe with different language. But if you have a most recent plan, be rooted in that and take a hard look at that, why it worked, why it didn't work as you get into this planning process. You decide what your term is going to be. If you're starting it this year, 24 to 27, 24 to 29, whatever the organizational-wide plan. And think of an organizational-wide plan like an umbrella. It covers everything. But it's not the end-all and be-all. You may have a capital campaign. You may have facilities. You may be doing a fund development planning, such as we're talking about the ARPA cohort may focus on specific that. You may have a facilities plan if you're facilities-based. You may have specific program plans that relate to the mission or relate to the plan, but they're all very business planning and very oriented to those specific plans. I know with the ARPA cohort, there could be funding just around sustainability planning around the ARPA plan, irrespective of what's going on with the rest of the organization. Branding and marketing can be a separate thing. You don't have to work out all the details of this under a strategic plan, because if you do, you'll get too specific, you'll get too engrossed. The process will take too long and things change too fast. So it really often launches other planning processes, or those planning processes that you may have already underway feed into the strategic plan. You have maybe a governance plan of where your board's going to be in 3 or 4 or 5 years. Now, that's an area that a lot of typical strategic plans don't deal with directly. They'll often be programmatic fundraising, facility related, but not really dealing with the board. Where's the board going to go? Where's the board leadership? Is there succession issues? Is there an executive succession planning going on that may need to plan? Do you have an emergency executive plan in case something happens to your executive director unexpected? What do you do? Those are all sub plans that kind of feed into an organizational plan and goes vice versa. And technology. Technology, we're doing Zoom. 5 years ago, we would be in person. Technology has shifted everything, including remote workforce. So it has a lot of impact on the organization. I was with an organization last week that it literally laid off a part-time administrative person because now with AI, artificial intelligence, they're using the artificial AI AI assistant because they do all their meetings in Zoom now, and the assistant's writing all the minutes, notes, and everything else. And now all of a sudden you have this artificial assistant there at the meeting rather than the physical clerk. And they felt they could save money. I had issues with it, but it was and I don't think any of us thought that AI was going to be what it is last year. That's a good example of something that has changed dramatically the technology and how we do business. So there's a lot of planning, and this kind of goes into the live strategic culture. There's a lot of things that are going on. It all doesn't have to happen within the strategic planning process. You don't want it to be, but you want it to cover it. And if there's things you can't do, but you would like to do, that's okay. Acknowledge the reality about that. Maybe there'll be an opportunity you can do it sometime. But this is just kind of giving you an example of how the ideas, how the generative process within an organization, dynamic organization can work when you're dealing with a very dynamic environment. Starting the discussion. So when we talk about your reasons for doing this, what's your expectations? Again, you don't want to get into an engaging planning process and find out people have different understandings of why they're there and what they're going to get out of it. Have those discussions out front, what your plan period is, and what's your motivation and your capacity to support the process. Not necessarily capacity to support the solutions or the strategies, but to support the process. That's the priority here of getting the process and not getting into a process you find out you can't support and you need to abort in some way. And it starts with, have you had a plan? Is this a continuation plan? Is it an updated and existing plan? Very different. Or are you starting anew? Or is it your very first? Which case there might be a lot of different expectations about how you're going to go about this and what it is. You have to have champions on this when you do strategic planning in terms of your leadership, your staff, your management. There's different values here. Some folks are very participatory, some folks not. Some folks are very board and executive director oriented when they go through this. Some folks want to involve consumers and funders and expand out. So who are your leadership team? And generally, virtually most of the time, boards have board strategic planning committees that lead this. They may have an executive committee if you don't have the bandwidth. You may involve other people outside the organization on that. Again, it depends on how you do it. Very large organizations, like a hospital, for example, may very well have executive management work out the plan. There may be some involvement at the board level. The management brings it to the board buys it. It depends on how engaged your organization, and you got to think about how knowledgeable or experienced are they. This kind of goes to where you're getting consultants, where you're buying knowledge and experience. You may have a lot already if people have had experience. You may also find that you'll run into board members that have done that, did that, it's not worth it. Because they've invested a lot in previous organizations, becomes a shelf plan and nobody really implemented it. And they just feel it's a long process, it's tiring, can be fatiguing sometimes, and then ends up not going anywhere. So you may find some folks within your team may have had that experience. And it is all about how do you make it work. Are there focus areas that you already know going into it that are priorities to you just based on what you know now? Are there particular challenges that are clear priority? Get that out. Talk about that now before you get into the process. It may impact on who you hire as consultants and their perspective and what they bring into the situation. Do you have fix-it issues? That kind of goes back to the capacity issues. Are there things here that demand immediate attention or demand attention that you've ignored, or your organization may not be in a position to do a 3-year plan yet? There may be things you have to do this year to get yourself positioned to best take advantage of thinking really longer term and broader. If, for example, your financial office is in turmoil, or if you have your accounting, you're not going to generate the information, and you can't do a whole lot thinking 3 years and ahead of time if you can't get that organized initially. If you have a lot of turnover on the board level, at the officer level, at the executive director level, you may not be in a position to plan. If you're in a crisis situation, organizational crisis, deal with the crisis first before you get into thinking about what you're going to do 3 years from now, because you're not going to have the bandwidth. People are going to be sucked into the crisis that happens right now, and it's going to be hard to get a process going. But that may be a 1-year plan of what you need to do to get yourself positioned to really be able to invest the time to think out of the box and think longer term and fix maybe some fundamental issues. Are there things off the table that you just don't want to talk about? Are there elephants in the room? There very well may be. Talk about it. You're going to talk about it in the strategic plan process. Is better to talk about before you get into it, again, for a more efficient, effective process, and it doesn't derail a process or open up conflicts. If there's things you're unwilling to deal with now, a strategic plan process is not the process to deal with it. You may need a consultant to help you deal with it, but I'd say get yourself positioned to be able to do strategic planning. And that means the elephants. A classic elephant in the room is we spend a lot of work. We have this relationship building fundraiser that sucks all our staff energy and time energy every year, but we never really raise money, but people like it. And as you start getting into, is it worth all the time and energy? Well, it's named after a board member, or, there's something like that. We really have to work around it. Have that conversation up front. If there's anything like that you really are having a hard time dealing with up front, and be better off dealing with the process. How generative do you want to be? Do you want to think out of the box? Are you open to a lot of creative thinking? Are you really thinking incrementally where we can move the organization? Things are working right now. We want to make them better. There's certain kind of restraints we have right now. What's your challenge from change? Some organizations go into this, say, we're looking for transformational change. Our markets change, our demographics change. Our systems aren't working out. We need to move differently. Maybe we need to merge. Maybe we need to do something along those lines. Are those things off the table as a strategy? Going back to the previous conversation, or things that you just aren't going to be considering in the process, or if people bring it up in the process, you're not going to be able to really effectively deal with it. The more you can have that kind of open conversation, the better you're going to be. And it comes back to ultimately, what are you going to get out? And as I'm saying, what's your vision? Why are you doing it? Where do you want to go as an organization? And again, that vision is going to change through the process as you look at it. But it's good to have the conversation. Why are you doing it and where are you going? The mission and values conversation. You have a charitable purpose, so there's some information you can gather on this because it gets confusing. Your tax-exempt purposes are what's in your articles of incorporation or charter. It's also what you've told the IRS when you got your tax application, your C3. It's also something that you may have amended or changed over time. That is your legal purposes. That is what you are, as a tax-exempt organization, allowed to substantially do programming under or activities under and not pay taxes. There could be some legal issues with that, in that you could say an organization just serves the city of Pittsfield and XYZ areas, and all of a sudden you have an opportunity to provide programs in Adams, Mass. You start doing that. You're outside your mission. You're outside your legal, that technically is taxable, because now you're outside of what you're the ones that put that geographic limitation in. So you want to know what that is. And many organizations change missions when they do strategic planning, the mission statement, the popular statement. They change it when in the 990, every time you do 990, they ask you if you changed your mission and what that changes every year. So you want to look at your articles of incorporation, what does your bylaws say if they say anything? What do you say in your 990? Do you get an audit? What does the auditor say? What do you say on the website? What does GuideStar say? Pretty well see if there's too many mission statements out there that have been redone or refancied, and are they aligned? It's an information gathering process. It can be very revealing sometimes. But again, it's something you can do beforehand and work it out as much as possible so that the strategic planning process can be efficient on that. But know who you are and know where you're going. And if you're going to change it to a strategic planning, you know what you're changing or why you're updating it or what the situation. Again, there's popular statements we make as inspirational statements, and then how do they relate to what we legally are for our purposes. So is there clarity and unity in that? And a second way of looking at this, and this should be something that you look at in strategic planning, is how do your programs relate to your mission? So if you have a good sense of what your mission is and your purpose is, and you're on the same page about that, then are your programs core to your mission or your programs secondary? I mean, we got some funding over here, so it's kind of secondary to us. It relates to our mission, but if you had to cut a program because you had to invest in it, that's what we would cut. Your core programs are really the driver, mission central kinds of activities. It's a good conversation to have. Related to that, you should also be able to have your programs by program budgeting. You know, what's each program, what revenue is attached to it, what the expenses are, what are you subsidizing, where's your deficits? That can, when you have to make cuts or you need to decide you need to invest in other areas, those are critical things to have. So it's good to have the conversation, and people debate about this because there's favorite programs. And again, if you're not clear about your mission, you can't be clear about your mission. And there is a thing called mission drift, I think, as many of you may be familiar with, where folks kind of go after money, and pretty soon they expand a lot of ways, but they've lost the core to their mission because it's more about the business and generating revenue. And when you start having these conversations, if you're in that case, that issue will emerge. And what's your values or beliefs? And I say pillar principles or beliefs, the core 4 or 5 values that you have as an organization, whether it relates to diversity or relates to confidentiality or relates to professionalism or relates to how you treat your consumers or your clients. What are your core principles? And if they'll be stated, if you don't have them stated clearly, you can maybe have on your website, your personnel policies will have some values on how you handle your workforce. Your client policies, if you have them, your donor policies have some values. So they're there, but you may not have really been able to centralize them. Because when you get into tough decisions, ethical decisions or directions, or where you're going to invest money or where you're going to cut back, it may very well come down to how not only mission related are they, but is this an exercise of your values? Is there clarity, unity? So it's a good conversation to have. You may want it to be facilitated. But again, I would suggest break out the conversation before you formalize into a process. Your process. This gets into how you're going to do it. Who's going to spearhead it? Is it a board-led process? Is it an executive director of management-led process? Is it a partnership between the two? How does that work? And I've seen this a number of times, if the executive director leaves during the middle of a strategic process, pretty proud that I throw the strategic planning out the window because it was heavily there. If you hire a new executive director, does that mean there's a new planning process? Or does it belong to the whole organization? If you've engaged the whole organization appropriately, if you exchange all the board and the management, it should not be something that changes because of personality changes here and there. It should be something that's relatively stable. Doesn't mean you don't update it lively, but a good strategic plan process should have some roots in the organization and ownership. How transparent do you want to be? This kind of goes back to how you operate now internally, whether or not even your staff teams know what's going on in the organization. Is the board kind of its own world with the executive director? How communicative are you internally now? And then how communicative are you to external stakeholders? It's tough to be communicative to external folks if you're not open communication internally. But there's reasons, there's confidential information that may come out of this. There may be legal issues if you've had any suits or liability exposure that's out there. There may be proprietary concerns if you've had trademarks or anything along the lines of curriculums that you've copyrighted, anything along those lines that you need to protect. That's just not going to, you say you did a strategic plan, you're all going to throw it out there. You may be talking about competitors in the process. So you think through that. in terms of participatory, and you can even do it where it's kind of elevated over time. You start with a core group, and then as you go through, you strategically communicate to certain stakeholders and groups. It also comes back to who do you want input from? Again, the more you seek input from outside the source, the more they're going to expect to get a return back and see what the return is and how you evaluated that. It's also the more costly it can be in terms of process. And that comes down to how much you want to invest in the process. So talking about a $10,000 grant, not a lot of money when you talk about it, and how much process and how much, if you're going to do focus groups, you do surveying, it's something to talk about with consultants. They're getting involved in terms of where your own priorities are. And it kind of goes back to what do you want to get out of it and what's your priorities for the process to be able to get out of it what you want. And you're not going to be able to do everything. You also don't want to spend 10 months doing a 3-year planning process. It will not work. Even 6 months can be too long because things change. And you're going to find that you're constantly now catching up, doing something different, and the process is continuing. You want it to be a compact, efficient process. And that's why having some of these conversations can help that. And then it gets into your consultant to your vision. One of the questions regarding that, who are they accountable to? So if you're going to involve you may involve, if you have an auditor, you may involve the auditor. If you have a legal staff, they may involve them in some areas. If you have a marketing consultant already, maybe they're going to be involved. So it's not necessarily that it's a strategic planning consultant. There may be other folks that are involved with the organization that you'll be engaging in the process, and you'll be paying them for that engagement. So you have to think broadly. If you are going to do a strategic planning consultant per se, who do they work for? Is it the executive director? Or is it the board? Who are they accountable to? Who's managing the consultants? How does that work? And it goes both ways sometimes, but you want to be clear about that. The consultant will want you to be clear about that because it can be confusing because there's a lot of engagement processes happening here. So is the person a facilitator, a designer, a manager of the process, or are you going to manage it internally and they're an outside resource? Is there a specialty expertise? As we talked about, if you were going into, if you really think our real priority here is fund development, but we don't want to do a fund development plan, but we want that to be the real focus here, you probably will go out and get a strategic planning consultant to manage the process who's got a lot of fund development background. However, that may not be working for governance issues that may come up or programmatic issues that come up. And so when you go that way, understand there may be limitations of that. Now, later on, I call it consultant drift sometimes. They'll say, well, this is my specialty, but I could do this, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. Yeah, again, the more you think about the skills that this individual may be bringing or any other people as a team, you want to package that. Is there data analysis that's going to need to exist? Do you have existing data analysis around surveys, focus groups? How's that fit into a time frame? Financial trend analysis, a lot of the smaller organizations have bookkeepers, but they don't do financial analysis or trend analysis or the broader financial analysis. Again, a strategic planning consultant that you may bring in may be generic and not have that kind of expertise, and you may need to purchase that somewhere else. It kind of goes back to knowing what you're doing before you get into the process to find out you don't have the information you need. But you will probably be doing a lot of trend analysis and financial analysis that would drive sustainability issues as well as some program analysis in terms of what may be core, not core, where you're investing the resources, what resources you have. And then there's the drafting of the plan, which generally a strategic planning consultant would do. But if it's an organization, you may have staff do it or executive director do it, and the consultants are just adding resources and expertise into the process. So there's a thinking process attached to this is the key to it. Data, look at what data you have. There's demographic. You may have program and constituent data, another area that you may be weak on going into the process. If there's ways you could beef that up beforehand, it may be worth the resources to do it rather than getting into it and saying, well, we really don't have good data. We really don't have a good database. We talked about, I think Berkshire County Community Foundation Technical Assistance was on data and that kind of thing. You might want to get that fixed and get that first before you start a planning process, for example. You got audits, financial statements, donor data, an area that can get pretty proprietary on how that information is handled. You want to know your funding, grant timelines, everything you need to do to feed the process beforehand. Again, I can't emphasize enough. You don't want the process to get bogged up because now you got to go out and get data you could have gotten before. Workforce policies, data and trends that may come up as an issue, personnel, that you may have turnover in workforce. You may find that you don't have diversity in workforce. You may that you desire. You may find that your compensation or your benefit structure isn't allowing you to be competitive with a workforce, and that's a problem. That's one of those areas that a lot of boards was like, well, we can't deal with that. We just have to accept it. It's a conversation to have up front. Board inventory. Again, I would encourage if you're doing the broader umbrella strategic plan, you also look at board performance, board organization, board leadership, succession planning at the officer level. What's the expectations for board performance? You're going to move the organization in a direction for 3 years. You got to think about, do we have the board, or what do we need to do to have the board to support that movement, and not look at that as a separate issue. Because ultimately the board's making the decisions around budgets and doing a lot of other activities here, and a lot of the other strategic, a lot of the other planning that we're talking about. So what do you have regarding that? Public policy. A lot of organizations are advocacy oriented. Where's things going in public policy? Funding trends, public policy funding trends that may affect. You want to get the information as much as possible, perhaps from any state or national organizations you may be affiliated with, or larger regional organizations that may be able to give you that information. Again, the more you can set it up to feed the process, the more efficient the process would be. Technology. Are you able to support dashboards, tracking? We talked about measurements and evaluations. Do you have the tools to be able to do that? Do you have the technology expertise to be able to do that? And you may not. And that doesn't mean you don't move forward. You just recognize that's a need you have, and you address that in your strategic plan as you move forward. But do you have enough to support the process? Or is that something you would buy from a consultant, or someone else would set that up for you? And who's your collaborative partners? And what's your market? And I'm saying market in terms of whether it's client market, donor market, and who's your market competitors. We all have the value of collaborating. The reality is we all compete at the same time. And whether you're competing with workforce, you're competing for donors, you're competing for grants, and it can be a difficult conversation to say who's our competitors. It's a conversation you should know when you're moving ahead. Other people are doing their strategic plans, and you may be identified in that as a competitor. Or whether or not there be a collaboration or a strategy is collaboration. It's a conversation to have and to feel comfortable being able to have a realistic conversation. When you look at that, what do we have? What's accessible? What can we garner? Then you look at what you don't have, what you may need. And again, it might be a resource issue that you have to buy or purchase, or just acknowledge you're not going to have it during the process. We talked a bit about the consultants. Do you already have one? If you're looking at doing it, do you need to identify? Are you going to go through an RFP process? What's that RFP going to, and kind of a lot of the background here that we talked about would be fed into an RFP of what you may need or what you may be looking for. Who makes that decision? Is that a management decision? Is that a board decision? Is that a collaborative decision? What are the qualifications that you seek? Whether a lot of organizations want people that are familiar with the mission and business models, because then they can see they can advance that, or familiar with how their culture. But at certain times you may have new opportunities or new changes, and you might want to think differently than just staying in the track or lane that you're in. That's something to consider. Is that even going to be consideration in the process? The more you can anticipate that. Is there expertise, as we talked about, that you're looking for? You really got to have somebody with some technology expertise. You really have to have somebody who understands the programs, or you really look at fundraising as being a part. What is it, if there's any expertise you need, or you're looking generic to pull everybody together and pull the resources together? Out of person, in person, Zoom. We talked about this being an engaging process. If it's a local community organization serving a local community, not a statewide, it may be better to do it having in-person meetings as much as possible with some hybrids, because you want people to relate. You might talk about really tough issues, and you want people focused on it and looking at people in the eye on it, and not looking at their email while the meeting's going on. How do you want to handle that? And that can make a difference for a consultant in terms of the consultants coming out of New York or coming out of Boston are not going to be able to be in the community, is going to be Zooming. How important is that to what you see you may need? Is it a firm or an independent consultant, independent contractor? That's a question. Are you hiring somebody out of university, or there's a team of folks? Are you actually entering into an independent contract? And then independent contract gets into things like, is there insurance? You got to make sure the person's working independently. Are you looking for minority businesses or women-owned small businesses? Is that a priority and a preference? Kind of goes back to values in terms of how you want to, does that shape your scope or shape what your priorities might be for hiring a consultant? And of course, there's deliverables attached to this. And that's where I'm kind of emphasizing, the more you can anticipate process, the more you can make it efficient, the more you can make some of the harder conversations before you get into it, the more you're going to better use of that consultant time, as opposed to having the consultant end up spending in Norton's time trying to work out issues that could have been discussed beforehand. Because that would eat up resources and then have an impact in terms of the end product that you may be getting, or if you're going to have to rush it because of resources. There's references, reputation, the cost. It's fee-based, hourly, is it flat fee? Is it based on deliverable? How is that going to work? And all the contracting, getting a contract together, all the pieces around that contract. And I will emphasize, there's typical contracts here, but confidentiality is an important piece. Non-disclosure is an important piece because if they're coming in and they're looking at donor lists, they're coming in looking at proprietary, and they're also doing strategic planning for 3 other organizations in the community, you want assurances that your information is your information, your plan is your plan. That's not going out anywhere, and you put that in a contract. And do they have liability insurance and professional insurance in case there's any issues that emerge here regarding how anything may be handled? Those are things we sometimes neglect in these kinds of contracts. The document itself should be board approved at the end of the day. At the end of the day, the board should own it. Whatever the process is or whatnot, the board owns it. It should identify accountabilities and timelines. Some folks will go broad strategic directions and with a good synopsis of why they're going in this direction. And sometimes plans are just like charts. And if you came on the board 2 years from now and you looked at that plan and you knew, you wouldn't understand what was the rationale in going in that direction. It should be able to explain this to anybody. There's key issues, key analysis. What directions are you going into? And then it really goes, how far do you want to get into the weeds of how is this going to happen? What's the work plan? What's the details? What's the financial investment? Or does it spawn off other planning processes? Maybe with a board development committee looking at the governance plan, the fundraising plan, the fundraising committee looking at developing multi-year fundraising with these goals and within these parameters. Again, it doesn't all have to happen within this plan document. Should have an executive summary. Typically, the executive summary is what folks make public on their website and whatnot. And that's kind of vetted to make sure there's not anything in there that you really don't want to have to say that might be in your internal plan. Who are you going to release what to who, when? You'll make that decision as you get near down the end, and it also may depend on who you engage in the process. As I'm saying, it might reference other work plans or sub plans that might be in much more detail. You do want to align your plan with your fiscal year, because you don't want to, if you have a January fiscal year, you don't want a strategic plan to be completed in March of that year. You've already made your budget decisions, you maybe already made personnel decisions, and now you're going to kind of cobble something, and then it's going to go into the next fiscal. So the more you can tailor and align your strategic plan to happen during when your budgeting process occurs, the better. Too many times they fail because the investments aren't made in accordance with your strategic plan. It's not live in terms of your financials. So you got to think that way, so you don't end up in a case where it's out of line. So this year, well, we can't do anything because we already made those decisions. And then the following year, you kind of forget about things and the priorities change. You review and update it as needed. This is the critical piece about live. It's just a document. It's based on a point in time, kind of like a profit and loss sheet. And that's where we are now. It can change tomorrow. You update it regularly. If you have an active executive team, or if you have an active Committee structure, committees should be all having goals at your board level within the strategic plan. What pieces of there are they working on? They're giving reports regularly. If things change, the board makes a decision, things change, or if it's under the rubric of the executive director and management, they make those change. Most effective folks do it at least annually. They have a retreat every year. They call their board together for a longer period to deal with what has changed in their environment, other things that may be going on, and updating the strategic planning, doing updates to it, literally to the plan document, which is great when new staff come on board, or great when new board members come on board, because you can tell them this is where the organization is going. This is our situation. I suppose, well, we thought about this 2 years ago and we really haven't done much with it, but things have changed. It's not relevant. And who, as I talked about earlier, the board as a whole, depending on the size of the board, sophistication is working with the executive director, or is there a particular committee that's kind of spearheading and championing this process? It's always good. Some organizations will have an ongoing strategic planning committee that's functioning all the time. Some will have a liaison, a board member who's a champion of the process, who's the person that is always saying at the board meeting, when you're making a decision, go left in terms of right. How does this relate to our strategic plan? Do we need to change this? Because you can very easily get back to everyday business and you're back up to doing that and you leave where you're at. And it's always good to have somebody, and it shouldn't always be the executive director, who has that in their mind. How does this relate? And do we need to make any other decisions? Does this affect our priorities now? Does it accelerate our achievement of priorities, or are we now displacing a priority? That's the live piece about it. Just thinking about that and always keeping that at the top of your agenda as you're moving ahead and getting lost in your day-to-day business. So that's a very quick synopsis of getting ready. I don't know if anybody has any questions or.
Doug,
Yeah.
I have a question. Do you have any advice as organizations are looking to identify a strategic planning consultant, or sending out an RFP? Is there like a list, a website of people to think about?
Well, the Nonprofit Center has a stable of folks that they work with to recommend. Sometimes there's retired executives that might be good. You may have a national organization or statewide organization that may have it. Some organizations will use former directors of peer organizations. Some will go academic. It kind of goes back to also how much you want to spend and how much can they contribute expertise-wise and process-wise to what you want to obtain. It's not an easy thing, because you make the wrong move on that, it's the wrong move. And everybody's engaged in it. So you do want to be as thoughtful as possible. I think, and it's something we can talk about, for the ARPA folks anyway, next week. But I know that probably Nonprofit Center is the one source that has plans. Again, you have to also think about information staying yours and not being used somewhere else, or the person's ethics in terms of how they may be working with peer organizations in the same community. It's a good thing to put up. I think the Nonprofit Center may have a list of folks that you can ask around your peer organizations who they used, and to be honest with you, who's not worked for them as well, and why. Because somebody hasn't worked for somebody else, maybe that wasn't the right fit, and they might be a good fit for you depending on your needs. I don't know if that's helping you. But certainly, I mean, you're in the situation with Community Foundation where you're getting proposals for strategic planning and they're identifying consultants. So in some ways, you may know what the market is.
Yeah, I mean, we're now going into our third round of these grants. And so, we don't have the capacity to vet consultants, but what we do, people ask, is we say, here's an organization that had a similar need to yours, and we can put you in touch with them, and you can see, what do they think of the consultant they use. So we do that kind of informal networking.
Yeah, and it's in some ways that may be the best way of doing it. And there's board members also. I mean, again, if you decide you want to become a very entrepreneurial organization, and you're going to move in that direction, then you're going to be more slanted towards earned revenue and business models than you're going to be about grants and general fundraising. You know, and that in and of itself would cause you to go in a certain direction with a certain skill set that someone would have that would be very comfortable in doing entrepreneurialism or business, as opposed to fundraising or somebody who's very familiar with government funding, for example. And if that's your base and that's what you're really looking at expanding on programmatically and otherwise, then you want somebody who understands that. And there's certain programs like a child care program is going to be a child care program, you know, and they're looking at expansion or they're looking at workforce issues. There may not be any big new initiative or anything. They're going to be dealing with the world of child care and the financing world of child care, and probably will want somebody who understands that world in detail because they got to go deep into it.
Do we have some questions in the chat?
Yes, one person asked if the slides will be shared. We will have the presentation online on the grant guidelines website. And I'll defer to Doug if he'd like to share his slides or not.
No, that's perfectly fine. I'll just take, for some reason, I added a couple blanks as I was going down here, so I'll just take them out and that's fine. They can be shared. I got to say, this was 35 slides to begin with. And that's why I had to make priority. I didn't put a summary slide in, and I didn't get into all the strategic planning minutia you get into, but just really try to focus on being smart about getting into the process and being efficient about it with limited resources. And again, I want to say the other end of this, just on the limited resources, there's financial resources and then there's your own bandwidth at the board level and staff level to support, even if you have the consultants. So it may limit what your focus is based on what you can do. So you're not going to feel like you got to deal with crisis and you just don't have the time to do strategic planning, but you're 3 months into it already. That's an honest conversation to have internally beforehand.
Great. And we do have one question about the timing and eligibility of funding. So someone that, let's say, is completing their strategic plan in February, are they eligible for the grant?
So really, we're looking for expenses that will be incurred from April onwards for these grants. All right.
So there may be,
And,
there could be with that statement, there could be a sub plan or it's doing a more specialty plan tied to a strategic plan, at least for the ARPA folks, that could work. Would that be true? That's true for.
yeah, so if there was something that would enhance, so
Yeah.
the organization's already committed to strategic planning, they're already underway, but with additional funding, they could do more, they could add on more, that would certainly be.
Like a technology plan or something along those lines. That's the way to think about it. Again, this isn't the end all and be all. It's an umbrella.
Mhm.
Anything else?
Great. Well, thank you, Doug.
Yeah,
That's a very
thanks.
comprehensive overview. And I think the fact that we've recorded it will be helpful to many organizations going forward. So thank you for letting us do that. And thanks to everybody for taking the time to be on the
Yes,
call.
thank you, everybody. And if you have any questions, you can contact me or anything along those lines. Okay, that's
Perfect.
okay.
Or Aileen or myself, we're here to help.
Yes. At Berkshire Taconic, you can email grants@berkshiretaconic.org. Or ask to speak to myself, Maeve. And yeah, we look forward to the applications.